If Daniel 3, that phrase doesn't ring a bell to you, what the chapter is about most certainly will. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three Jewish kids who stood up to the most powerful man on the planet at the time. It's a story that we're all very, very familiar with. But what we need to remember this morning is that it's not just a story. This isn't a fable. It's not a tale. It's much more than that. It's a real event that took place in a real time and place with real people facing very real pressure in their life and death type of pressure. And so if you wouldn't mind just joining me one more time, and we're going to pray, and then we're going to get started. Father, Lord, I do thank you so much for this chapter, Lord, and it's familiar to us, and it's popular for a reason, Lord, because it can speak into our life. And so I pray, Lord, that your Spirit would do so this morning, that you would speak to each one of us, that we'd hear exactly what we need to hear. And we give this time to you in Jesus' name, amen. As I said, and you know, these three young men facing incredible pressure, but they refused to bow when their entire world at the time was bowing. Everything around them was bowing towards this one thing, but they didn't give in. They stood alone. They refused to bow. And that's why it's so applicable to our lives, because we all have moments in our lives. Every single one of us has moments in our life when we're faced with choices to give in to pressure. Can I get an amen from anyone? Okay. We face pressures, and it's as varied, the pressures are, as it is people that are sitting in here this morning, but we all have these pressure. And pressure is defining for us. It forms who we are, how we respond to that, right? Because I could, theoretically, I could hit free throws in practice by myself, sitting in the gym all day long. But if I keep bouncing off the front iron in the game, it doesn't matter. When the pressure's on the line, that's when it matters. That's when when it really changes who we are and how we react to pressure. And again, you can think of what it is in your own life, whether it's emotional or physical or psychological or whatever that pressure is, and you think of that in your own life, how we react in those pressure situations in our life, both our successes and our failures define who we are. They shape our life. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is an encouragement for all of us who go through fiery trials, no matter what that fiery trial is. None of us are probably in danger of being thrown into a furnace, but we all have these things. And so it's an encouragement for all of us. And it reminds us as well that God can sustain us and protect us in the trial, right? Because the trials, they're coming. They're here. They're inevitable. And so not only do they shape us and inform us, and they remind us and give us encouragement, this story does, to go through it, but they remind us that God can protect us and sustain us when we're in them, because we can't avoid them. The trials are going to happen, but God can be there with us. And so before we jump in, we need to really understand the context, and part of understanding the context here is to just realize that chapter 3 follows chapter 2. You guys get that? Okay. Chapter 3, every time in the Bible, chapter 3 follows chapter 2. And that might seem obvious, but if you remember what happened in chapter 2, it's been a few weeks since we've been here in Daniel. But Daniel in chapter 2 had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, told him what it was, and interpreted this dream for him. And it was this statue that was made out of different materials and metals. And the interpretation briefly was as follows. Nebuchadnezzar, your empire, your kingdom, the Babylonian Empire, you're the head of gold. And then following that, another kingdom came with chest and arms of silver. That's the next kingdom that's going to come, the Medo-Persian Empire. And then Alexander the Great and the Grecians is seen in the next portion of this statue, these belly and thighs of bronze. And then the Roman Empire is pictured with 2 legs of iron, until finally you get to the feet, where we have this future empire, this revived Roman Empire. And the feet are made partly of iron and partly of clay. And then Daniel describes, as if that wasn't all strange enough, right? And again, we're familiar with that, but that's a crazy dream. But if that wasn't crazy enough, Daniel describes perhaps the wildest part of that dream next. He says, there's a great stone. This is what you saw in your dream, Nebuchadnezzar. A great stone, a heavenly stone, a stone that was not made out of human hands. It wasn't formed like the rest of this statue, but it came from heaven, and it struck the feet of the statue, this last portion of the statue. And it went on, this stone did, to become a great mountain. And this represents this coming kingdom that is yet to come, that is going to never end. It's going to be everlasting, just like we read about in Psalm 111, this faithfulness and his good works. This kingdom will never end. It is the kingdom of Jesus Christ that is going to put an end to all the faulty kingdoms of the earth. That's chapter 2. So there's a period of time between chapter 2 and 3, but Nebuchadnezzar, there's an obvious connection. Nebuchadnezzar takes all this info. He thanks Daniel. Hey, you nailed the dream. You nailed the interpretation. He gives him and the boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he gives them all promotions. But Nebuchadnezzar is so inspired by this dream and realizing that this dream of a statue is about kingdoms and he's a part of it, that he says, I'm going to make my own statue because my kingdom is so impressive, I'm going to make the whole thing out of gold. And so I want us to understand there's this connection between chapter 2 about this dream that he had and what we read about here in chapter 3. So let's pick up verse 1 of chapter 3. It says, Nebuchadnezzar made an image or idol of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. Bible students, how long is a cubit? 18 to whatever inches. Yes, good job, Will. It's the distance. They didn't have, Fat Mac Stanleys, They had arms and elbows. So it was the distance from your fingertips to your elbow. That was a cubit. That's how you measured things, and a span of a hand, and all these measurements that you carried around with you. And so this is 60 cubits in height, and its width 6 cubits. And it says he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he has this rebellion in his heart that isn't dealt with. He was impressed by Daniel and his God, but he's more impressed with himself. And so he's got this rebellion inside of him, and he's talking about crushed statue? I don't think so. Broken into pieces? Not on my watch. And so he makes this huge golden idol. And again, it's about 90, because it's 18 to 20, whatever inches, as Will said. It's about 90 to 100 feet tall and about 9 to 10 feet across at the bottom. And this statue is incredibly slimming, if I can use that word. It's very slimming because this is a 9-to-1 ratio. It is 9, for every 9 this way, it's 1 wide. The average human is 5-to-1. So this is an odd-looking statue in and of itself, and it very well may be that it was on a raised base as well, and it actually had more of a 5-to-1 ratio. We can't say for certain. The other thing I want to point out is that it was probably overlaid with gold. I don't think that the whole statue was gold. If it was pure gold, there are those who have done some calculations. It says the weight alone would be over 5 million pounds. Gold is heavy. It's also expensive. And so I went online and I figured out how much 5 million pounds of gold is worth. And it's just a shade under 100 billion, But who really matters at that point? How does that, 100 billion? Man, imagine that Powerball lineup. Gosh. Whatever the ratio, whatever the worth of this statue, it wasn't about how much it was worth. What it was about is allegiance. This statue was a test of allegiance. Are you going to fall in to this empire, this world's way of thinking. And so Nebuchadnezzar thought that this test would mark down his greatness for the rest of time. And he thought, this is a way to show off allegiance to me. But we're going to find out that this test is really going to be about God showing his greatness, about how great he is, and what can happen when men stand up in allegiance to him. So it says in verse 2, he built this, verse 2, and King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Everybody's there. There's 9 classifications of people. I can't remember off the top of my head. But everybody's there. Anybody who's anybody is there. If we put it in our terminology, we'd say the senators are there, the representatives are there, the governors are there. There's some big city mayors that are there. They're all there. And there they are before the image. Verse 4, then a herald cried out, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages. I don't care where you're from or what your background is, but you are commanded this, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now at this point, if I can have you turn to 2 Kings 24. Keep your finger here, we're going to be right back. But I want to take this moment to remind us about what King Nebuchadnezzar was like. In 2 Kings 24. Because no one stood up to Nebuchadnezzar. It says, you are commanded, you shall do this. And no one stood up to Nebuchadnezzar and his regime. He was the top dog. And this, as I said, this wasn't simply about, this wasn't just a religious service. It's not even that. This is an act of, we're following you. We're in agreement with the way you think. And to not bow down was personal. It was treason. And so he's giving everyone, all the bigwigs, language, people, nations, all of them, it is time to show in this ultimatum, either you're going to bow or you're going to die. That is what is on the line. Look at the very last sentence of 2 Kings 24. This is only maybe 15 years before what we're reading now. Then Zedekiah, who was king of Judah, rebelled against the king of Babylon. Now, here's what we need to remember for this. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who put Zedekiah in place. They were a tribute nation at the time of Babylon, and he put Zedekiah there, but Zedekiah rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, and here's his reaction. This is normal reaction to how he deals with those who do not submit to his authority. Chapter 25. Now it came to pass, in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and encamped against it. And they built a siege wall against it all around. Again, siege walls, so brutal. It doesn't sound like much to us. Okay, well, whatever. It's really brutal way to go. Built it all the way around in verse 2. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then the city wall was broken through, and all the men of war fled at night by the way of the gate between two walls, which was by the king's garden, even though the Chaldeans were still encamped all around against the city. And the king went by way of the plain. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued against the king, against Zedekiah, and they overtook him in the plains of Jericho. He didn't get too far. all his army was scattered from him. So they took the king Zedekiah and brought him up to the king of Babylon, which is Nebuchadnezzar, at Riblah, and they pronounced judgment on him. Look at verse 7. Then they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him with bronze fetters, and took him to Babylon. This is Nebuchadnezzar. This is how he deals with those who do not submit to his authority. And so to Zedekiah, the very last thing that your eyes are going to see is me taking the last breath from your sons. And then I'm going to take out your eyes, and so you have that image burned with you for the rest of your miserable existence. And he took him away to Babylon. And so for him, the instructions are very simple. I built this statue. I assembled the band. When you hear the band play, you bow the knee. That is what you do. And if you don't understand it, go ask Zedekiah. He's around here somewhere bumbling around. And for most, the governors, the counselors, the magistrates, all these other people, it's not that big of a deal, right? They understand. Nebuchadnezzar's the guy. He's in charge. And so if he wants us to bow, it's just going to take a few minutes. It's just this thing. I just don't want to make that psycho mad. I'm just going to do it. I'm not willing to face the repercussions. And so, verse 7, back in Daniel chapter 3, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the harp and the lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And if you can, I love trying to picture myself at this scene. And if you can just picture this huge image and this huge orchestra and band assembled, and the music starts, thousands upon thousands of people, just waves of people just falling to their knees, just dropping to their knees, just one after another, just like a dominoes before the statue. But, verse 8, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused, and in the Hebrew it's literally chewed in pieces, the Jews. Verse 9, they spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Now, before we continue here, I want you to remember about the last time we read about these guys was in chapter 2. That's why the context and going verse by verse is so important. These guys, these very guys, were the ones that were on the chopping block last chapter. These are the guys that couldn't tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream. They couldn't give the interpretation of it. And so what happened? Daniel pleaded their case. Daniel said, save their lives. And now the very ones that saved them, they're trying to kill. They're jealous, selfish individuals, and they owe their lives to these guys, but they're trying to have them killed. It's unbelievable. So they say, "Oh, king, live forever. You know, things are going great. We totally get what you're doing, but there's a problem." Verse 10, "You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music shall bow down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace." They repeat this edict back to him. Verse 12, but here's the new information, Nebuchadnezzar. There are certain Jews, not just certain people, there's some racism going on, some anti-Semitism going on behind the scenes. There's some certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province. They're putting some of the blame on him. Over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And here's their names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Now, I like to think for myself that I was there, that I would be one that stood. I don't know. Because the temptation is I could just play this off, even in a spiritual way, right? God's gracious. He'll understand. I don't want to rustle all these people's feathers, It's not that big of a deal. It'll be over before it even begins. And plus, if I do something different, I might lose my witness with these guys. And that's the temptation that we can have in our fiery trials. And we live in this world, and you guys know, where there's these pressures to bow, to give into the flow, to accept the world's way of thinking. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they don't give into it. They may be failing Nebuchadnezzar's test, but they are passing the Lord's test for their life. And so, verse 13 begins, then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and fury. That is a common temperament for him. I don't know that he ever woke up on the right side of the bed. His bed probably doesn't have a right side, That's the wrong side, this is the wrong side, but I have to get out of bed. That's him. So in rage and fury, he gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? He is enraged, but he's still giving them the benefit of the doubt. These guys have been valuable. He has given them promotions. They've been faithful in the past. But he's saying, is this true? Are you defying me? And now for them, the pressure is mounting. There's pressure that when they were out there at the plain of Dura to bow down, but now the situation is heating up. And maybe we've had instances like this, right? Again, I don't want to read this simply as a story, but as an illustration of the trials and the testings that we deal with. And so maybe you've had a circumstance like this where you don't give in to sin, where you resist the urge to slander or gossip or to click on that porn or to give in to the addiction or to take a financial shortcut. And whatever it may be, you stand up to it only to realize that there's more pressure coming. That's not the end. There's more pressure that's going to come, and it's even more intense. And that's what the enemy wants to do to us. He wants to put the screws to us all the more because we're standing against this. And so he's going to give them another opportunity to go with the flow. Another opportunity. And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar does here. Is it true? And he says, now, verse 15, if you are ready, maybe you just weren't ready for this. Maybe you didn't understand all the facts. But now, if you're ready, at the time you hear the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. This is what the enemy always says. If you give in, it's good. That's going to be the best thing for you. And following God is not. The enemy wants to convince you that the giving into the sin, giving in the trial, that's the best thing to do. Take the easy way. Take the broad road. Take the broad gate. Take that. But man, that's the way to go. Don't follow what the Lord has to say because that's not worth it. That's hard. That's difficult. And so Nebuchadnezzar is presenting that to them here. If you're ready, I've made them good, then fall down. But if you do not, he continues on, if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? He's on an ego trip, man. He is feeling it. Now, to him, this is simply a rhetorical question. He knows he's the top dog in the world at that time. Who's the God who could possibly save you from what I'm going to do to you? That is what he's asking them. But Shadrach and Meshach, he may be asking it as a rhetorical question, but they're going to give a literal answer to this. And I just love this. But again, we have to remember, let's put ourselves there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at this point in time have not read beyond verse 15. They don't know what's coming like we do. Imagine the pressure of this situation. There's not one of us that have faced anything similar to this. Now, we have brothers and sisters overseas that certainly are, that they're putting their necks, even today, on the chopping block, so to speak, for Christ. But none of us have had to deal with this. So just for a moment, put yourself in their sandals. They're standing before a man who is powerful beyond measure in worldly standards, who is brutal beyond imagination. And he's in your face. Is this what you're going to do? It's time to make a decision. What are you going to do? The music has stopped. Everyone's silent. Everybody's watching. There's thousands and thousands of pairs of eyes that are awaiting your response. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? What are you going to do? Will you bow? This is just so intense. Verse 16. They're living this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. There's no debate in our mind. There's no second guessing. There's no stressing out about, man, that's a good point, Nebuchadnezzar. There's no stress about that because they've already made the decision to follow God long ago. When they found themselves in Babylon back in chapter 1, if you were with us, it says they resolved with Daniel not to defile themselves. We're going to follow God no matter what the culture says. That's what we're doing. So it doesn't matter who in that culture is demanding me to go against what God has commanded. Now, please highlight, box, circle, star this verse in your Bible and the person in front of you and behind you because it's so important. Verses 17 and 18, I love this. If that is the case, they continue on to Nebuchadnezzar, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. Notice verse 18, please. But if not, there is a lot of TV pastors who will just teach you verse 17 and not teach you verse 18. There's a God that can, and he will deliver you. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understand, but if not, they say to Nebuchadnezzar in the moment of pressure, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods. It's not a question, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up, because it's not a god, it's just a gold image. You can throw me in the furnace, you can ridicule me, you can kill me, you can just get more and more furious. It doesn't matter. You can have your way with me, but we will not compromise because our God is able to deliver us. We're weak, we're frail, we mess up, we can't deliver ourselves, but our God is able. But even if not that he's not able, but even if he chooses not to deliver us from this fiery furnace, that doesn't change the fact that we're going to continue to serve him and not some stupid image. That's what matters. And so whether we burn or not, that's not even the question, Nebuchadnezzar. That's not even the matter. God is going to deliver us from you. That's going to happen one way or another. So burn me up. And this phrase that keeps coming into my mind in this chapter, in this portion, is burn me up because I'm already on fire for him. It doesn't matter. Just do what you want to do because I'm already raging in fire internally for the king, the real King of Kings. And so it doesn't matter if I'm going to live for another 10 minutes and you decide to throw me in. I'm going to live those 10 minutes for him. Every moment I'm going to live for him because that's where the real fire is. And so we're not going to do it. Our God's still God. Your image is still stupid. And verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was being filled earlier. Now he's full of fury. His heart is racing. You ever see those people where they get veins in their temples that, they start to pulse a little bit. His eyes are popping. And now picture this from his perspective. He is the most powerful man on the planet. 3 Jewish kids saying, I'm not going to do what you say. He is not about to be intimidated and bossed around by those guys in front of every other dignitary in the empire. He has to follow through no matter how much affection he has for them. He has to follow through with this. And so it says he spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. I need to make an example. Again, apparently Zedekiah was not enough. I need to heat this sucker up so everybody knows. And if you can see it and follow along and keep making the application in your own life, that here's the test, here's the trial, then it intensifies. It's intensifying again. That's what happens with trials. They just get hotter and hotter and hotter. And 7 times is a way to say as hot as it could be heated. And so Nebuchadnezzar commanded, verse 20, that certain mighty men of valor who were in his army bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So in these Babylonian furnaces, they were clay or brick kilns. They had a 2-door system to get draft and control heat. And so there's a side door and a top door. And so it would appear from the text that they were dropped in from the top and then seen from the side, just to help you understand what we're reading, because it says they took them up, and then these guys are consumed with the heat. They just flew out of that. Verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, I don't know what's 7 times hotter. They didn't have a way to measure heat like we do, but we understand that these ancient furnaces that the Babylonians had could heat up to about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot, really hot. And so these guys are just incinerated, and they fall down. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. They're just walking around, just cool as a cucumber. That's like astonishing to him. Like, what is going on? And the form of the 4th, he said, is like the Son of God. Now, I want you to turn here really quick, and I appreciate your patience. I know we're getting on, but if you could flip to chapter 43 of Isaiah. Isaiah 43. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know Jesus, doesn't know the promise of the Messiah, doesn't know any of that, but he understood there is something divine going on in this furnace. And even though there's a fire raging, there is one that stands out from the rest of them. There is one that is different. And I have no doubt in my mind that even leading up to this, and while they were standing before Nebuchadnezzar with the threat of the furnace in their face, Isaiah 43 was on their mind. It says, just into Isaiah 43, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I'm convinced that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're experiencing this right now. They're familiar with that text, and they're worshiping in the furnace. They're praising God in the furnace, but not Nebuchadnezzar. Back to verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. We get the impression that they would have stayed in there all day long. He has to bark the order to him to come out, come here, get over here. It's time to get out of this. And there's this very specific reason for them to be ordered out, because Jesus was walking with them in the trial, in the fiery thing. He's talking to them. He's communicating them. He's having a relationship with them at this time. And I imagine that they're cool with that. In the fiery trial, they're good with that. They're okay with that. Why leave this hangout time, sweet fellowship with Jesus for that guy, right? His veins popping, all that. There's no way I want to do that. Now, here's where the real application again comes to our life, because we don't just want to look at this as a great story. That's neat. That's fantastic. And so we want to see the application, but I don't know that we're fully going to understand this application until we get to the other side of heaven. But if you trust the Lord in your trial and you know fully and believe that God is good, that he is able to deliver you, he has the best plans for you, there is communion and fellowship in the trial with Jesus that you can't experience and you can't understand outside of the trial. And so with the Lord, I wonder what the Lord is saying to them while they're in there. I imagine that he's encouraging them. Well done, my good and faithful servants. Well done, boys. You stood up when the whole world was bowing. You stood up. And I think that he was also explaining to them, this is why the masses are out on the plain of Dura on that day. So they can see not that Nebuchadnezzar is great king, but that I am the King of kings. And so that people aren't impressed with him, but they're impressed with me. Nebuchadnezzar asked, who's the God who's going to save you? He has an answer. And so does everyone else who's watching you in this trial. And so this pressure, this difficult season came into your life. This test came into your life so that my power can be seen in it. And so not only is there incredible, beautiful fellowship with Jesus in the trial, and for those of you who have not walked with Jesus in a trial, that sounds like foolishness. But for those who have walked with Jesus in a moment of difficulty and trial, you know this is gospel truth. There is sweet, sweet fellowship with him there. That's one thing that happens in the trial. But there's also a beautiful purification process that takes place when we go through the fire with Jesus. I just want to look at a couple verses here that we've already read. Verse 20 said, he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind, number one, Shadrach, Meshach. Verse 22, then these men were bound, number two, in their coats or trousers. It goes on, skip down to verse 23. It says they fell down bound into the midst. They want us to the text is letting us know they were bound up. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He arose and he said, did we not cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? And what blows him away is one, this other who's like the Son of God, but he says, I see four men loose. That's amazing. It's bound, but I see four men loose. When they trusted God in the trial, the only thing that was destroyed by the fire of that trial was the things that bound them. This is mind-blowing to me. They were freer in the fire than before they actually were thrown into the furnace. The same fire that was intended to destroy them only destroyed what had them bound. This blows me away. But again, some of us know this is true, that this is reality, that in the trial we have this sweet fellowship and communion with Jesus, and it's not us who's destroyed in that trial. It's the things that keep us from being free that are destroyed in our trials. And so we try to avoid them, and I don't think we should be a sadist and rush into a trial, but trials are an incredible opportunity to get rid of baggage that we have a hard time setting down at other points in our life. And so the fiery trial the enemy wants to use to destroy you, that wants to use to burn you up and crush you, whatever that is for you this morning. If you trust Jesus with it, it's just going to burn up the things that are holding you down. If you can make that application, man, you are doing well. Well, he calls them out. I think they kind of saunter out to him. Verse 27, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Get the point? It didn't affect them at all. I can't get near my barbecue without losing arm hair. And I don't have a lot to lose, I can only imagine some of you, man. But they don't rush out. They're called out. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's not a believer yet. Here it's not blessed be my God, but blessed be the God of. That moment's coming in chapter 4. I hope you're here next week, because chapter 4 is another mind-blowing chapter in Daniel. Anyway, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, and who trusted him. That's an important little phrase too, who trusted him. Easy to say. You can't trust someone you don't know beforehand, right? You can't meet someone and trust them. If I told you, man, you need a babysitter, why don't you ask one of those kids at 300 North Pearl? I'm like, well, who lives there? And I can tell you who lives there. It's the Scheffer kids. I'm like, oh, no, thanks. No, but the first question we have is, well, I want to know them. To trust them, I have to know them. And so for them to trust God, understand this, their level of trust in him was equal to how much they knew him and about him and his faithfulness and trustworthiness that we just read about again in Psalm 111 that never ends. And so if you're having a hard time in your life trusting God in your trial, the answer isn't running away to him. It's to press into him, to get to know him more. Then your level of trust goes up. And it says, the king went on, it says, they've frustrated the king's word, yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. They weren't frustrated by the pressure of the trial. They frustrated the pressures of the trial by their trust in God. It's amazing. Nebuchadnezzar, verse 29, went on and said, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language, which is everybody that showed up that day, which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, shall be cut in pieces. That's his answer to a lot of life's issues, so I don't necessarily think that's a great, evangelism tool, but and their houses shall be made an ash heap or a dung heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. I love it. He still doesn't get it completely, but he's working on it. He's got his own trial he's going to go through in the next chapter. Verse 30, then the king promoted, not just let them be, the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. This chapter is one of my favorites in the Bible. Maybe you can tell because I'm a little passionate about it, but it's a favorite because it's applicable to every single one of our lives. We are called as believers in Jesus Christ to not go with the flow, to not just drift along with the world. This is what you should watch, and this is what you should listen to, this is what you should believe, and this is what you should protest. And we're not called to that. Romans 12, verse 2, man, you should write that maybe in your margin above this chapter. Do not be conformed, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Jesus said in John 17, be in the world, but not of the world. We're called to be different. And so there's a couple things really quick for us to consider so that this doesn't just become another story, but steps that we can apply it to our life. And so we have something to learn. And I'll go through this quick. But number one, understand your need to have godly believers around you. I can't overestimate how important this is. There is strength in numbers, and we need each other. The people around you, we need each other. It's fact. It's a fact that's attested to in Scripture, and it's a fact that's attested to by current studies. I read a study where they did this psychological test, but they had 10 students in a room, and they told the students it's a visibility test. But beforehand, they pulled 9 of the 10 students aside and said, what we're going to do is we're going to hold up lines that say A, B, C, and D. And what I want you to do is when we ask what's the longest line, say the second longest. They told 9 of the 10 students that. And so in the time for this psychological test that the kids are being told that was a visibility test, they held up the sign, which line is longer, A, B, and C? A is obviously longer, but 9 of the 10 students, B. What happened to the one? What do you think happened? Over 80% of the time, the one who knew better was like, yeah, B, even though he knew that wasn't the answer, that wasn't the way to go. We're influenced by those around us. Therefore, shouldn't it be all the more important that we surround ourselves with people who are good influences? That aren't going to tell us that B is longer when A is obviously longer. And so just one more person by our side committed to following Jesus with us can make a world of difference, to hold us accountable for those trials that, whatever they are for you, come up, the addiction, the porn, the slander, the whatever it is, someone by your side walking through it with you. So number one, understand our need for each other. Number two, be prepared. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego never had to mull it over. They never had to, here's the positives, here's the negatives. Let's do a pro and con list of whether we should bow the knee to his idol. That never happened, because from chapter 1, from that very first moment, they resolved, I'm not going to defile myself. I don't care what happens. So, one translation put it this way. The Voice translation says, King, we don't need to defend ourselves. We're ready for the test. We should be ready for the test as Christians. And so understand your need for believers around you. 2, be prepared. 3, trust God. Yes, the verse 17, but there's also verse 18. But whether it's verse 17 or 18, I'm going to trust him for both. He can deliver. He's able to deliver. But even if not, I have this radical trust in him that I can go through the most uncertain things of life and know that it's going to be okay. Job said, though he slay me, yet I trust in him. Just trust the Lord no matter what's going on. Number 4, remember that Jesus will meet you when you need him the most, in the midst of whatever your fiery situation and your trial is. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we could spend eternity looking at this story and just drawing observations and truths from this. They weren't running around in the furnace trying to put out the fire. Isn't that amazing? They weren't searching all the corners looking for a way out, because in that trial, they had Jesus right there in the midst of it. And I bet if we asked them today, would you rather be in the fire with Jesus or out of the fire without Jesus? I know that they would say in the fire with Jesus. And so, because it's in the fire that we really understand and can appreciate this beautiful relationship and fellowship we have for the Lord. Amen? Let's pray.